Before we get started, I wanted to show you the finished project and just talk through a little bit the size of the dishcloth. So we crocheted in the round, and it's 11 inches in diameter. The stitch pattern that I used is a cluster stitch in the round. There are 9 total rows, 8 of the cluster stitch, and then the 9th round is actually a single crochet border all the way around. Look at the yarn. Isn't that pretty? I like it. I like it a lot. So let's get started and I'll show you how to make the project. The items that you'll need for your project. I've got some scissors. I've got a row marker. I've got a yarn needle to sew in some tails if we have any. I have my crochet hook. It's a size H crochet hook. And I have this yarn. It's called Sugar and Cream by Lily. It's called Scrub Off. It's a size weighted 4 yarn. It calls for an H8 5mm hook. The color on this yarn, it's called Beach House. Look at this part right here of the yarn. It's got a lot of texture to it. Sort of reminds me of that coconut yarn that has the fuzz on it. Look at that. Isn't that cool? Over here on this side. I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started making our washcloth. So the first thing that we're going to do is make a slip knot and put that onto our crochet hook. I have my yarn tail. I take that yarn tail in my hand and I just wrap it around my fingers and stick this yarn back beneath and grab a hold of it. Grab a hold of my working yarn and my tail and just pull it up tight. Then I just put my hook into that knot and then grab that yarn tail. It tightens right up onto my hook. I don't put it too tight. You want to be able to move your hook around with that yarn on your hook. So now we're going to do 5 chains. So go underneath your yarn and pull it through the loop on your hook, and that's a chain 1. So chain 2, 3, 4, and 5. So now you're going to get your row marker or your stitch marker, and we're going to mark a stitch. This 4th chain here, we're going to put our stitch marker right there into that chain, and we're going to mark it. Because when we're finished our first round, that's where we're going to actually end off and close off round 1. So I'm having a little trouble here apparently. So I marked the 4th chain. Now we're going to start round 1. We're going to put a double crochet in this very first chain here. I'm just having little issues getting that yarn to stay on my hook today. Okay, we're going to put a double crochet into this very first chain that we made. So we're going to yarn over and we're going to go right into that first chain. We're going to yarn over and pull our hook back through, and you should have 3 loops of yarn on your hook. Yarn over, pull it through the first 2 loops, and then yarn over and pull it through the second 2 loops. That's a double crochet, and I'll show you one more time in just a moment. Now we're going to chain 1, so go under the yarn and pull it through. That's a chain. Okay, now you've finished your first double crochet and you chained 1. Now you're going to put 6 more double crochet chain 1s into this same chain here. And I'll show you one more time a double crochet. So double crochet, yarn over, put it through the chain, yarn over and pull it through, yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops, yarn over and pull it through the second 2 loops, and then chain 1. So once you finish those, you go all the way around and stop. And I'll show you how to close off your round in just a moment. Okay, now we're all the way around, and what you should have before you close off that round, you should have 8 chain 1 spaces. So this first chain right here, when we started, we're going to count that as a double crochet. So you've got 1 space, you've got 2, you've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then when we close this off right here, this is going to be another chain 1 space, and it sort of is going to look like a little wagon wheel. So I'm going to take this stitch marker off, and right there where I take that stitch marker at, that's where I'm going to put my hook. And if you can't get it in there, you turn your hook sideways and use that little hook there at the bottom, and you can get behind that yarn. And you're going to put the front of that chain onto your hook. So that chain, when you see a chain, it's got 2 pieces of yarn on the front and 1 piece of yarn on the back. So you're going to put that hook through the front of that chain where the front 2 pieces of yarn are. You're going to yarn over and pull it through. Then you're going to pull that yarn right through the yarn that's on your hook. That's a slip stitch. So you closed off round 1. Now we're ready to start round 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a slip stitch into this next chain space. So we're going to move our yarn over just a little bit so that we can start our round. So we're going to go right into this chain space. We're going to grab a hold of that yarn and pull it up. So you have 2 loops of yarn on your hook. And now what I'm going to do is just pull that first loop through that second loop. That's a slip stitch. And now I'm going to chain 2. So 1, 2, start a cluster. This is the first cluster of my round. So I'm going to yarn over and put my hook through this space. Yarn over and pull it through. I have 3 loops of yarn on my hook. I'm going to yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops, leaving 2 loops yet left. Then I'm going to yarn over. I'm going to go back into this same space, yarn over and pull the yarn up. I should have 4 loops of yarn on my hook. I'm going to yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops. So you should have 3 loops of yarn on your hook. Now we're going to yarn over and pull that yarn through all 3 loops of yarn that's on our hook. Now we're going to chain 2. So chain 1 and 2. So now I'm going to show you how to do the cluster stitch into this next space, and then that's going to be the repeat that you're going to do all the way around for round 2. Just to create our cluster, we're going to yarn over. We're going to insert our hook into this next chain 1 space, yarn over and pull the yarn through. You have 3 loops of yarn on your hook. We're going to draw up our yarn, yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops. Then we're going to yarn over, go back into that chain, yarn over and pull it through, yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops. You should have 3 loops of yarn on your hook. And we're going to do one more. Yarn over, go back into that same chain 1 space, yarn over and pull the yarn through. We're going to yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops, and you should have 4 loops of yarn on your hook. Now we're going to yarn over and pull that yarn all the way through all 4 loops of yarn on our hook, and that's a cluster. So chain 1 and chain 2, and that finishes our stitch. Now we're ready to go into this next space, chain 1 space, and we're going to do another cluster. So yarn over, go into that space, yarn over and pull it up, yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops. That's the start of your first double crochet. Now you're going to start a second double crochet. Yarn over and go through, yarn over and pull it up, yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops. That's the start of your second double crochet. Yarn over, go through the chain 2 space, yarn over and pull it up, yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops. That's the start of your third double crochet. Now you're going to close that off, yarn over and pull it through all 4 loops of yarn on your hook. And then you're going to chain 2. So you create your cluster and chain 2 all the way around, and do that cluster stitch into each of those chain 1 spaces. When you get around, see you back here. I'll show you how to close off and start round 3. Okay, I've gone all the way around, and now I'm going to close off round 2. So you see where we marked this stitch right here, this chain, first chain after our cluster. The stitch right before it is where we're going to close off. You see right here is your chain, and then this, see right here, that's where we're going to do our slip stitch. We're going to yarn over and pull it through, and then we're going to go ahead and pull it right through the other loop of yarn on our hook. And that's a slip stitch, and it closed off round 2. Now let's talk a little bit about round 3. Let me take this stitch marker off before we get started, because this is where we're going to increase and grow our dishcloth. If we continue doing the same stitches we did on round 3 or that we did on round 2, what it's going to do, it's going to stay the same size, but it's going to create a ball. So we need to increase some stitching to make it be able to still lay flat and grow out like a disc. So now we're going to start round 3. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a slip stitch in this chain 2 space right here. So putting my hook through, grabbing that yarn, and then I'm going to just pull that first loop of yarn through the second loop that's on my hook. And now we're ready to begin our cluster. So what we're going to do in round 3, and what the repeat is we're going to put a cluster, chain 2, cluster into each of these spaces. Each of these chain 2 spaces around. And when you finish round 3, you should have 16 chain 2 spaces available to you for the next round. So to start off, we're going to chain 2. So 1, 2, yarn over, go into that space, yarn over and pull it through, yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops of yarn over and go back into that space, yarn over, pull it through, yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops. Now you have 3 loops on your hook, yarn over and pull it through. That's your beginning cluster when you start your round. And right here, right next to your hook, that's where you're going to end your round and slip stitch to close off round 3 when you come back around. I'm just going to go ahead and mark it. Now you're going to chain 2, 1, 2, and you're going to do a cluster into this same space here that you did your beginning cluster, and that's the double crochet 3 together. So yarn over, go into that space. That's your first start of 1, second, and here's your third start. You should have 4 loops of yarn on your hook, yarn over and pull it all through yarn over and pull it through the 4 loops of yarn on your hook, chain 2. Remember, there's a chain 2 between each cluster. Now you're going to put a cluster, chain 2, cluster, chain 2. Then you're going to put a cluster, chain 2, cluster. So there should be 2 of them in each of these spaces all the way around, and that's going to be our increase stitch. And that's how we're going to widen out our dishcloth. So we're going to put 2 of those in each of those spaces. And I'll do one more for you just to show you. So we did our cluster, we chained 2. Now we're going to put another cluster into this stitch. Oops. We have 4 on your hook, so yarn over and pull it through all 4. Then we're going to chain 2. We're going to put another cluster in that same space. And that's our increase. 4 loops of yarn, yarn over and pull it through all 4, chain 2. And now you're going to do that all the way around. And when you get back around, come back, I'll show you how to close off and end round 3, and we'll start round 4. So we've made it all the way around, and now we're going to close off this round by doing a slip stitch into the top of that first cluster when we started. And now we're going to go over into this chain space, and we're going to do another slip stitch. Now we're ready to start round 4. Before you start, just to make sure that you have enough stitches in that round 3, you should have actually 16 chains 2 spaces. So if you count them, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. You should have a total of 16 chain 2 spaces in that round. Now what we're ready to do is to start round 4. What we're going to do in this round is we're going to do another round of increasing. So what we're going to do is we're going to chain 2 and do a beginning cluster, chain 2 and do another cluster, then we're chaining 2 and we're going to do 1 cluster here, 2 clusters here. So we're going to alternate 2 1 2 1 2 1 all the way around. When you end round 4, you should have 24 chain 2 spaces. I've already did my chain 2, so I'm going to yarn over, go in this space, and I'm going to make my beginning cluster. I'm going to chain 2, and then I'm going to do my second cluster stitch into that same chain 2 space. Yarn over, I'm going to pull through all 4 loops, and I'm going to chain 2. Now I'm just going to do 1 cluster here. And you'll do that all the way around, and I'll see you at the end, and I'll show you how to start round 5. Now we're at the end of round 4, so you're going to go into the top of this first cluster that you did to start the round, and you're going to do a slip stitch to end round 4. Now you're going to go over to this first chain 2 space and do a slip stitch. Now you're going to chain 2, 1, 2. Before you start round 5, just so you know, so you can make sure you have enough stitches on round 4 to properly make round 5, you should have 24 chain 2 spaces in round 4. Now we're going to increase again for round 5, and how we're going to do that, first we're going to make our beginning cluster in this first chain 2 space. So we chained 2 already. Now we're going to yarn over and go through that space, yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops, yarn over, go back into that space, yarn over and pull it through the first 2 loops. Then you're going to yarn over and pull it through all 3 loops of yarn on your hook. I'm going to take my stitch marker and mark the top of that beginning cluster that I just made. Now I'm going to chain 2, 1, 2, and I'm going to do a cluster in this next chain 2 space. Just 1 cluster. So yarn over and do my double crochet 3 together, double crochet 3 together, and that's the cluster stitch. And I'm going to chain 2. So I did my beginning cluster, I did 1 cluster, and now in this next space, we're going to do 2 clusters. So yarn over and go in, we're going to do, here's our first cluster, then we're going to make, and then we're going to chain 2 and do our second cluster in that same chain 2 space. And that's going to be our repeat all the way, repeating pattern all the way around row 5. Chain 2. Okay, so let me walk you through it before you get started. So I did my beginning cluster, chain 2, I did another cluster, chain 2, and in the next space I did a cluster, chain 2, and a cluster. So 1 1 2, and that's what you're going to do all the way around. You're going to put 1 cluster, chain 2, 1 cluster, chain 2, and then in this third space you're going to put 2 clusters. So 1 1 2, 1 1 2, 1 1 2, and you're going to do that all the way around. When you finish round 5, you should have a total of 32 chain 2 spaces. Okay, so we'll see you at the end of round 5. I'll show you how to finish off round 5 and start round 6. And now we're ready to close off round 5 and end it. And I'm going to do a slip stitch into that first beginning cluster on the round to close it off. Going to do a slip stitch into the next chain 2 space. Then I'm going to chain 2, 1, 2, do my beginning cluster, yarn over, and okay, after you do your beginning cluster, you're going to do 6 more clusters into the next 6 chain 2 spaces. So this 1 plus 6 more is 7 total. Then after you have 7, then you're going to put 2 clusters into the next space, and that's going to be your repeat throughout. After you do 2, then you'll do 7 into the next 7 chain 2 spaces, and then you'll do 2. Then you'll do 7 more, and then you'll do 2. And then you're going to do that all the way around until you get to the end. So when you get to the end of round 6, you're going to have a total of 36 chain 2 spaces for the round. So when you get around, come back and I'll show you how to do round 7. Okay, now we're at the end of round 7, and we're going to end the round just like we have all the others by slip stitching into that first stitch that we made. And then we're going to go over to this chain 2 space, and we're going to do a slip stitch, and then we're going to do our beginning cluster. So it's chain 2, yarn over, and go into that chain 2 space and do your double crochet 3 together, chain 2, mark that space on that stitch of that beginning cluster. Now to begin and start round 7, you're going to do 8 clusters in the next spaces, and then you're going to do 2 clusters after that. So this cluster counts as 1, this beginning cluster. So you'll do 7 more clusters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So with these 7 plus this beginning, that's 8. Then you're going to do 2 clusters in this stitch. After that, you'll do 8 clusters into the next 8 chain 2 spaces. And then after you get those 8 done, into the next chain 2 space, you'll do 2 clusters. And remember, between each cluster, you do a chain 2. So I'll see you around when you get to the end of round 7. We'll slip stitch to end the round 7, and I'll show you how to finish round 8. Round 8 will be our last round, then we'll do a border. Okay. I've just closed off round 7 with a slip stitch. Now we're going to come over into this first chain 2 space and do a slip stitch. Now we're going to start round 8 by chaining 2 and doing our beginning cluster. Once we get our beginning cluster done, then we're going to go ahead, do our chain 2. Now we're going to do 8 more clusters with the one that we already did. This counts as 1. So we're going to do 8 more plus this 1 is 9. So 9, total of 9 clusters, 1 in each of the next chain 2 spaces. And then once we get 9 done, you'll do 2 in the next chain 2 space. So 9 single clusters and then 2. 9 more, then you do 2. 9 more, then you'll do 2. Then that'll close off round 8. See you back here, and then I'll show you how to end round 8 and then do our border. Ended round 8, and I slip stitched into the top of that first beginning cluster on the round. Now I'm going to start my final round, which is a border on the project. So I'm going to put my hook right into that same stitch that I did my slip stitch, and I'm going to do a single crochet. So grab your yarn, pull it back through, and you should have 2 loops of yarn on your hook. Yarn over and pull it through both loops of yarn, and that's a single crochet. I'm going to get my stitch marker and mark the top of that single crochet stitch, and when we come back all the way around, that's where we're going to finish off and complete our border on the project. Now into each chain 2 space, we're going to put 2 single crochet. So go into that space, yarn over and pull it up, yarn over and pull it through both loops. That's a single crochet. So 2 single crochets, and then 1 single crochet into the top of this cluster stitch. So find the top stitch there on the cluster, go into that stitch and do a single crochet, and then 2 single crochets into the chain 2 space. And you're going to do this all the way around. 1 single crochet into the cluster stitch, the top of it, and 2 single crochets into the chain 2 space. We'll see you back around when you complete your project border, and I'll show you how to fasten off and sew in those yarn tails. So see you in just a bit. Finished my border all the way around of single crochets. Now I'm back to where I started. I'm going to remove that stitch marker, and right in the top of that stitch marker I'm going to put my crochet hook, and I'm going to do a slip stitch and fasten off. So I'm going to get my scissors, cut that yarn tail, grab that yarn and pull it all the way through. And I'm going to pull it tight, and that has fastened off to my work. I'll see my washcloth in the round. It's really nice. So now what I'm going to do now is we're going to sew in this yarn tail, and when I sew in the yarn tail, we'll be done. So thanks everybody for watching. Watch out for new videos coming your way, and see you soon.